My colleagues and I, and through these years, I've been connected to over 100 colleagues in mental health. We have seen incredibly violent individuals that have been influenced by the video games. And in one case, we had a gentleman who's an adult male, was playing so much video games that he was not sleeping much. He actually became homicidal, meaning that he wanted to kill people. He made a list of people he wanted to kill, and he even admitted that the violent video game helped him to imagine how to execute the killings.
Fake news, fake woke, distract and divide. You're either right or you're left or you're black or you're white. Big tech don't need a microchip to hack in your life, because the phone inside your pocket is a tracking device.
Well, hey, everybody, welcome to Our Watch with Tim Thompson. I am so excited to talk today about one of these very, very important topics, and that is the violence in the video games. So many people play video games, and, I'm of the mindset that it's really not good for us, but, I'm just a pastor, and I think it's important that we hear from a professional. So we have somebody with us today that really knows what he's talking about. He is a doctor, Dr. Andrew Doan, and he's with us today. Dr. Doan, so grateful to have you with us on Our Watch today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I want to ask you, just before we get started, just what are your credentials so that way people know who they're hearing from?
Well, first and foremost, I'm a Christian, so I come from a Christian perspective. That's important. But I got my medical degree, or MD degree, from the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. And during that time at Hopkins, I spent another 4 years to get a PhD in molecular neuroscience, and I studied learning and memory, and also familiar with brain development. And then I went off and got a training in eye surgery, and then also aerospace medicine as my postgraduate medical training. And then I also, in that process, got a master's in public health degree.
All right, so you know what you're talking about.
Well, it just became a passion of mine. So I also have been studying this topic for about 10 years now, over 10 years. And so about 10 years ago, in the research academic literature, there was only maybe a dozen academic papers on gaming and violent gaming and gaming addiction in general. Today, there's over 1,000 research papers on the topic.
Wow. Yeah, I first heard you, it's been over a decade ago now, first time I heard you speak, and you had said some things that really revolutionized the way I think and the way I address certain addictions in my congregation. People coming to me all the time with issues of pornography and gaming and alcohol and drugs, and you've got a way of explaining things that for me helps me understand what's going on, that there really is these neurons firing together, wiring together, are the reactions in our brains. So I'm glad that you're here to talk about, because we've got a lot of people talking about the mass shootings that are taking place, a lot of violence in schools, and a lot of people are saying, hey, this has a lot to do with the violence in video games, and you've got something that you want to bring to the table for us today, what you call the Swiss cheese model for mass shooter. You want to explain that for us?
Sure. So the Swiss cheese model is used for risk assessment and management in industry and businesses and organizations like the aviation community. So Swiss cheese has holes in it. So you have like all these little holes, and then you have slices. So the slices of the cheese are layers of risk that are inherent in the system. So in the mass shooter, for example, the first layer of Swiss cheese could be at the organizational or government level, such as improper regulation of gun sales, or too easy access to guns, or the not locking up the guns in the home, or laws about that. So that's the first slice. The second slice could be a familial or a community issue, such as the lack of having paternal influence in the family. So a lot of these shooters, if you look at the history, they are fatherless, and they don't have a man in their life to guide them. There's also the removal of God and prayer in schools. And so when I talk about it, I say there's a lack of moral compass, because without God, we don't have a clear north to follow. And for Christians, it's clearly Jesus. So that slice there is at the community level. And then we also have an individual level, the slice here, where medical doctors may not recognize the problems of early exposure of violent media to kids and how that's changing their mind and how it changes their development. And then also the lack of recognition that video game addiction is actually a real clinical problem. So that is associated with sleep deprivation, often severe sleep deprivation. So when an individual develops severe sleep deprivation, they can actually go into a psychotic breakdown and look like they're schizophrenic. They may not have previous history of mental health issues, but when they are severely, chronically sleep deprived, especially if they're gaming 18 hours a day, and there's a case of that, Aaron Alexis in Maryland in 2013, he was playing 18 hours of gaming, and this middle-aged, actually not middle-aged, like in his 20s, developed severe sleep deprivation, start hearing voices, start having a psychotic breakdown probably. I don't know for sure. I don't have the medical records, but from the news report, obviously his family was very concerned about his gaming. So when you have that, you can get a psychotic breakdown. So when you align all the holes together, then you get the perfect problem or the perfect storm for the mass shooter. So violent video games by themselves in a healthy child may be problematic because that child might be more antisocial or bothering the dog, or maybe, bullying his siblings after playing a violent video game. But it's not going to be a mass shooter. But if you have, let's say, a person or a child that basically is sleep deprived from violent video games, the violent video games has trained them on where to shoot, how to kill, and got their mind all revved up. And it lines up with now the lack of parenting, the lack of moral compass, and then basically you get now easy access to guns, for example, for that child. And what you're going to get is the holes perfectly line up to then create that perfect storm.
Well, I've never thought about it in those terms. And, when we hear about all the different video games that are out there and how addicted people become to this, it really is quite alarming for me. And, we wonder, how can somebody be addicted? Can you explain the addiction to these video games and how somebody becomes addicted?
So when I give these talks, I ask the audience, do you know anybody who is addicted to broccoli or cauliflower? Because in my 20 years of clinical practice, I have not met a broccoli or cauliflower addict, because the brain wants sugary, wants fun stuff. That leads to firing of dopamine in the brain. Dopamine and also other catecholamines like norepinephrine or serotonin are also released. Those are neurotransmitters that are associated with pleasure and associated with wanted behaviors. Let's say that, because sometimes even fear can also drive dopamine release too. So, and fear makes sense, right? Because if you see, like if all of a sudden I saw a rattlesnake in my room right now, dopamine would fire as I jump out of my chair. God designed our brains that way to reinforce behaviors that keep us alive and keep us healthy. So what happens is the brain gets hijacked when they play a pleasurable video game or doing anything pleasurable, like eating chocolate or doing something we really enjoy. But that leads to release of hormones in the brain through the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and it actually controls gonadal hormonal release, which are sex hormones like testosterone in men and estrogen in women, adrenal gland secretions of adrenaline and cortisol, and even thyroid hormones are being released, and even endorphins. And so we can use the endorphins, for example, clinically, to have kids play video games, and we can scrub the burns off of burn victims, kids and adults, while they're playing a video game, because it's just all the endorphins, all the arousal, all the less pain perception in the brain from that playing that video game. So that's how individuals can be hooked at the biological level.
So, we look at the connection, or at least part of the connection between these violent video games, the mass shootings, and there's some people that say there's no connection. And you talked about the different types of studies that are out there, and some of these studies are flawed. What are the flaws? What are the problems with some of these studies that are taking place?
So overall, there's been a lot of studies, and they do meta-analyses. Meta-analyses is that take little smaller studies, combine into one big study, but that's an imperfect way to look at data set. But that's the best method we have because it's hard to get 30,000 gamers and split them up in randomized groups and do research studies on 30,000 gamers. So instead, they pull like 100 papers together to get that large number. And so one of the problems that we see, well, first off, let's say that when they pull it together, there is a positive correlation. The correlation is like 0.17. But the problem is you look at that, and if you look at the public debate on if there's a link or not, they're only looking at that number without understanding the research and the protocols and the subject groups. So that number shows a mild correlation. So what we know for sure is that there is a correlation between violent video games and antisocial behavior. So when people, both adults and kids, play violent video games, they tend to have antisocial behaviors. But when they play pro-social games, they will have pro-social behavior in the community. So if you're playing a game where you're helping other people, you'll tend to want to help other people in real life. So, but the problem is the studies themselves are biased because most of the studies are done on adult males or adult individuals with violent video games that are mature only. So those are the shooter, very bloody, gruesome video games. In kids, however, the institutional review boards will not allow you to expose a 6-year-old child to a bloody, murderous game because they know the effects of violent media on children. So those IRBs protect the children and would never approve a research study. If you don't get a study approved, you cannot do it. So what happens is they pick a video game, like let's say boxing, or maybe another video game that's like more violent, but not quite to the level of the shooter video games. But these are not, if you look at them, are not really considered ultra-violent video games. But even with those video games, the kids show antisocial behavior. So the number that they get shows a mild correlation, but it's flawed. But when you apply that clinically, like I'm a clinician who actually see patients, and I'm interested in looking at risk factors that cause patients to break down, my colleagues and I, and through these years, I've been connected to over 100 colleagues in mental health. We have seen incredibly violent individuals that have been influenced by the video games. And in one case, we had a gentleman who's an adult male, was playing so much video games that he was not sleeping much. He actually became homicidal, meaning that he wanted to kill people. He made a list of people he wanted to kill, and he even admitted that the violent video game helped him to imagine how to execute the killings. So what we did was we hospitalized him, unplugged him from the video games, took him off all his medications, and made him sleep. As he slept, his homicidal ideations actually disappeared.
Wow, that's incredible. I think about what it says in the Word of God that we're not supposed to be conformed to this world, but we're supposed to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. And to hear you talk about this, how this person has something going on in their mind, it's not how God designed them, it's not what God wants for them, and so there's a change that has to take place, whether it's video games or it's pornography or whatever the case is, where there's some sort of addiction like that. What are some of the things people can do to renew their minds?
Sure. Be in the Word. So read the Bible every day. Be around Christians. It also says in Corinthians that, don't be fooled. Bad company will corrupt good character. So you got to pick your friends and hang around the right people. When you start playing video games and if it affects your mind or the movies you're watching is affecting your mind in a bad way, then you probably should not be playing those games and you should not be watching those movies. So you have to do self-checks on yourself. Now, keep in mind that I'm not an anti-gamer. I enjoy video games. I think it's a great way to be used clinically. It's also a good way to build friendships and bonds. So if adults out there in your church are playing violent video games, I'm not condemning that, because if they're playing, like, let's say, a battle royale game where there's teamwork and they're just having fun and they know it's more like a paintball, it's like a virtual paintball. So people go out and do paintball. And that's kind of like, emulated violence. But if they're going to do emulated violence for teamwork, knowing that it's all for laughs and giggles and entertainment, that's fine. So in a healthy way, it can actually be used in a way that I believe God would approve. However, when it becomes all obsessive for that individual, that is when it becomes a problem. And when there's intrusive thoughts, or they start to hear things or see things, or they start not taking care of themselves, not sleeping, breaking broken relationships with other people, not desiring to even attend church, either online or in person, having trouble with finances. They're pouring thousands of dollars into video games because they want to win and they want to have a competitive advantage. Then that is a problem. And that becomes now an addictive behavior or destructive behavior that can lead to severe ramifications.
You're talking about some of these video games. Last one I played was Pong back in like 1981. So I have no clue what you're talking about. But I hear what you're saying, and I think it's important for anybody who's a parent who's listening to this to understand these warning signs that you're talking about. And, you're talking about these warning signs that aren't just for kids, they're for adults as well. Obviously, it's the adults that would be pouring thousands of dollars into this. So those are some great tools for the adults, but are there some additional things that you could speak to parents? It's like, hey, as a parent, you really need to watch out for this.
Sure. So you definitely have to do. So what I tell people is that video games are like a drug, kind of like the description of how I said we use it in the clinic to numb burn pain or pain in general, so that we can actually do surgical procedures and burn debridement. So it's like a drug. You would not just give your child a bottle of painkillers and say, okay, go ahead and do what you want to do with these painkillers when you want. You have oversight. So video games should be age appropriate and time amount appropriate, meaning that from ages 0 to 2, there should not be any gameplay or media or screen time whatsoever. From 3 to like 11 or 12, you can introduce 1 hour a day, but have it to be educational, very slow moving, like old school Mr. Rogers back in the 80s type of slow moving types of shows for your child, but no gaming until like 13 or so. And then at 13, if you're going to introduce video games to their home, it should be age appropriate. So no mature only games, and you should play together as a family. So you can sit around and be engaging with your child and treat it like a game night. And that way you're building relationships, you get to talk about it. And if there's any controversial or material that you don't want your child to be exposed to that pop up in the video game that you're playing or the media that you're watching, you can actually have a family discussion about it. And that's what I would recommend.
Yeah. I think that's so important because even right here where I live, Riverside County, we've got a great district attorney and a great sheriff, and they have a great task force that's out trying to capture predators that are on these video games. I think parents need to be very well aware that there are predators out there. They are trying to use their these video games to find that pathway into your child's life, and they're preying on the kids. And there's no doubt that there are things that creep into these things that are going to corrupt the minds of our children. So I think it's a great piece of advice you're giving parents. Hey, if your kids are going to be on these things, be on there with them and monitor. And I think we as parents have a responsibility to monitor everything, not just the video games, but the television programs, the social media outlets. All of these things they can be really good, but they can also be used for some terrible, terrible things by the enemy.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And remember, the middle slice of cheese that I talked about, the Swiss cheese, was the lack of moral compass and lack of parenting in these mass shooters. If you look at the history of mass shooters and look into their personal lives. And so that is the component that is no different. I think the problem we face right now in this digital age is that the screens, because it's a painkiller naturally and also in the clinic, it is a painkiller that can be used as a convenient babysitter. So it's too easy in this busy modern world where parents often both parents are working, they're busy, grocery shopping, athletic events, church events. It's too easy to put the screen in front of the child so that they're quiet and occupied. And so that could be quite harmful. So the analogy I want the listeners to listen to or to take away is that that's like giving a bottle of painkillers to your child and say, take whatever you want when you want, because it's making you quiet and I don't have to worry about you.
Yeah. Yeah, and you bring up the point about the child and what this is doing in the life of the child. I want to have you back on the program again and talk about what's literally physically going on in that child's brain when these things are taken away from the child. You have a lot to say about these types of issues, and so we're grateful that you came on the show. We're running out of time right now, but how can our listeners follow you on social media and your website?
Sure. We have a ministry website called realbattle.org. And then you can also go to Facebook and just search Dr. Andrew and Julie Doan, Doan, and you can reach me in those two methods.
Okay, well, we're going to put those methods of contacting you in the description of this video. We're grateful that you joined us today, Dr. Doan. So grateful for your ministry and all that you and your wife do. God bless you, and we will see you next time right here on Our Watch with Tim Thompson.
Thank you. God bless you.